Welcome to my garage. I'm really glad to have you here today. Now, the topic of today is in regards to really atheism's best objections, right? The best atheistic or naturalistic or agnostic objections, and really kind of specifically to Christianity, but to theism even. Let a theologian, for once, answer the best arguments of atheists, those that involve the question, how do you know that? He's just presenting the epistemological argument. How do you know that what you know is true, right? But he gives them examples, and that's what I really like, because what's very important is to handcuff people to the definitions of what they mean or of what they're saying. If they're too fluid, if they're too loose, there's nothing to really grab a hold of to say that I have a meaningful response to you. I have something that I actually can say that you have to acknowledge, that you have to respond to. So I really like that Jerry Coyne gave a example. So the example, and we're going to do more than one, but out of what he gave today, we're going to start with this example. So Jerry Coyne says, let a theologian for once answer the best arguments of atheists. That's what we want, what's your best argument? And he says, these arguments are those that involve the question, how do you know that, right? The epistemological argument. And the example he gives is, what would convince you that the God you describe doesn't exist? So that's what we're going to focus on today, is what would convince me that the God I described doesn't exist? It's really simple for me. For me, if I'm describing a God that is different than the God described in the scriptures, and then I came across the scriptures, I would be convinced that the God I had been describing doesn't exist, and the God that the scriptures is describing does exist. That's way too easy. That is not at all what Jerry means. What is Jerry really asking? What Jerry's really asking is, what would convince me that Yahweh of the scriptures doesn't exist? So I'm going to give you my answers. Now, these answers are not in the order of most important to least important. My answers are actually in the order of sort of chronology. So chronologically, like what order I kind of roughly put together in my mind when things need to go in for me to be convinced that the Yahweh described in the scriptures doesn't exist. So don't take this as an order of most importance, because it's not order of most important. So the first thing I would need to be convinced that the Yahweh described in the scriptures, the one true living God, doesn't exist, is I would need for all of nature to operate in complete independence of symbiotic relationships. I would need to see organisms and life and ecosystems completely independent of each other, right? I can't have flowers depending on bees, and I can't have bees depending on flowers, right? Symbiotic relationships are sort of testimonies or witnesses to something being designed and implemented very near each other in their origin. Number two, I would need a standard with which we could measure right and wrong to be found within nature, but without an arbitrary origin. So what does that mean? Is that just fancy talk? No. What I would need is for things to be right and wrong actually, and I would need the way that they're measured right and wrong to be found inside of nature. And I would need that thing found inside of nature, measuring things right and wrong, to be independent of arbitrary origin. So it can't be human opinion. That can't be the standard with which I'm measuring right and wrong with, because it has an arbitrary origin. So it can't be opinion, it can't be mere conscience, it can't be anything like that. Well, what could it be like? Oh, the closest I've ever heard is like a Sam Harris approach, right? So the standard of right and wrong is the well-being and flourishing of sentient life. The problem is that definition is found purely within the opinion of sentient life. I can't measure that and say whether that is without arbitrary origin. Yeah, of course, sentient life is going to say, right, right and wrong is based on my well-being and flourishing. Of course it'll say that, but is that true? Third, I would need the library of scripture that we refer to as the Bible to not be the single most supported literary work in human history. I can't have the scripture be an anomaly of literary work such as humankind has never seen. I need it to match the rest of literary work, right? It's got to fall in those parameters. That's the third thing I would need. The fourth thing I would need is I would need all the archaeological evidence that's supporting the library of scripture to not support the library of scripture, or to completely go away, right? I can't have a bunch of archaeological evidence supporting this library of literary work that is an anomaly among humankind, and then just ignore it. I can't do that. Number 5, I would need the God Yahweh described in the library of scripture to express clear human bias for the sake of earthly gain, and certainly not to express the exact antithesis to that, right? And then the last thing I would need, and remember this is chronological, this is not order of importance, but the last thing I would need in order to be convinced that the God, Yahweh, described in the library of scripture is not existing, is I would need Jesus Christ to have not existed, to have not been crucified, and to have not risen from the dead. There you have it. I will go out on a limb as a believer, and I will tell you what I would need in order to be convinced that the God Yahweh described in the scriptures does not exist. So, if you find those 6 points easier to overcome than believing in Yahweh, by all means. For me, those 6 things are not things that I can overcome, all right? God bless. Happy quarantine.